tape script for the film strip Saul Man of Tragedy. From the Holy Bible comes a story of a man who is the tragic victim of his own passionate loves and hatreds. It is a story of an attractive, shy, sensitive man whose mind and emotions were not big enough for a king of God's people. Here from the first book of Samuel in the Old Testament is the account of Saul, first king of Israel. It is a story of a well-intentioned man who loved God and wanted to serve him, but who blundered and stumbled until his mistakes drove him to madness, and who finally died by his own hand. The story of Saul and his appointment with tragedy began before he was aware of it. It started on the day that the elders of Israel demanded that Samuel the high priest give Israel a king. "Give us a king to govern us like other nations," they said. "Yes, give us a king to lead us into battle. We want a king to judge us." After vainly arguing that Israel needed no king but God, Samuel finally consented to do the will of the people. "So be it then. You shall have a king," he said. "Now return to your cities and be patient. I shall seek for the right man. When I find him, I shall anoint him as king over the tribes of Israel." Now there was in the tribe of Benjamin a godly man named Saul, courageous, strong, and tall. When he walked in the midst of men, he stood head and shoulders above them all. One day as Saul, accompanied by a servant, was searching for some lost donkeys, he came to the hometown of Samuel to ask the help of the prophet-priest in finding the strayed animals. As they drew near, the watching Samuel heard the voice of the Lord saying, "This is the man who shall rule over my people." And before Saul could even make his inquiry, Samuel said, "Seek no longer for your lost animals. They have been found. But I would speak to you now of important things. Saul, do you know that you are the object of all the nation's desire?" And Saul said, "I am? Why, that is impossible. I am of the tribe of Benjamin, the smallest of all the tribes of Israel, and my family is the least important within the tribe." "Let me be judge of that," Samuel said. "I am the high priest of the Lord, and the Lord has spoken." Then gesturing away the servant, Samuel went back into town, saying, "Send your servant away. You and I must be alone with the Lord. Come to my house with me." That night, upon the rooftop of his home, Samuel spent long hours instructing Saul concerning the will of the Lord. Later, Saul knelt as Samuel poured holy oil over his head, saying, "The Lord hath anointed and consecrated you to be the prince of Israel. You shall reign over the people, and you shall save them from their enemies." Then Samuel bade Saul goodbye. "Now go. 7 days from now you shall meet me at the great shrine in Gilgal, and there I shall tell the people what I have done this day." And that same day Samuel the high priest sent messengers throughout the land, bidding all the tribes of Israel to gather at Gilgal 7 days hence. 7 days later the tribes stood assembled before the great shrine, and Samuel addressed them. "Thus spoke the Lord, Though I led you out of slavery and gave you this land, still you have rejected me and demanded a king. So be it, a king you shall have." And walking down through the people, Samuel went directly to Saul, who was standing modestly at the back of the crowd. Pointing to the young man, who stood so tall and strong, Samuel cried, "This is the man the Lord has chosen. See, there is none like him among all the people." And the crowd yelled, "Long live the king! God save the king!" But others cried, "This Saul is a man of no importance. Saul? Who ever heard of him before? Why should he be our king?" Saul, confused by this rejection, went back to his father's home in Gibeah. But there followed after him a band of enthusiastic young men who wanted him to be their king. Some weeks later, as Saul followed the oxen from his father's farm, a weary messenger told him distressing news. The Ammonites, our ancient enemies, have besieged our sister city of Jabesh-Gilead, and they offer to spare the lives of the people only if every man in the city consents to being blinded. A fierce rage filled the heart of Saul, and like a king he sent his followers out to the tribes. Go to the tribes and say, Saul and Samuel will lead the rescue of Jabesh-Gilead. Send your warriors to Saul. Quickly men came from all parts of the land to follow the banner of Saul into battle. And the next morning they fell upon the Ammonites and destroyed them. When the battle was over, some of the war captains came to Samuel, who stood near Saul, and said, There were those of our people who rejected Saul when you named him king. Point them out to us, priest, and we will kill them too. Then this will truly be a day of victory. But Saul strode forward and cried, You will kill none of the children of Israel. Is this a time for vengeance? This day the Lord has brought salvation to a helpless city. Your heart should be grateful, not filled with thoughts of murder. Samuel was pleased with the moral indignation of Saul and said to the rebuked men, Now go home and gather your people and come again to the shrine at Gilgal. Once more I will proclaim Saul as king. When the tribes had gathered again, Samuel spoke once more. My people, I have grown old and gray in the service of the Lord who has been your leader during all the centuries. Now as you have demanded, I have given you a king. And Samuel said, This was your choice, not mine. Yet if both you and the king will fear God and obey his commandments, he will not forsake you, for you are his people. And as long as I live, I shall continue to pray for you. 2 years went by. Saul the king, guided always by the aged wisdom of Samuel, gathered a standing army to use against the enemies of his nation, determined that God's people would be protected from those who would destroy them. Then a Philistine army moved eastward, driving the Israelites before it. As the days passed, Saul's retreating forces were depleted by desertions until finally only 600 soldiers remained with Saul. Fearing that the Lord was offended, Saul sent word to Samuel to meet him at the shrine of Gilgal, there to make offerings to appease the possible anger of God. When after waiting for 7 days Samuel did not come, Saul took it on himself to enact the role of high priest. Well-intentioned though it might have been, it still was an act of irreverent arrogance. And when Samuel finally came, he blazed with indignant anger at the man who thought he could force God to intervene in his favor. And Samuel said, Because of your sin today, none of your sons will inherit the crown of Israel. Yet despite the dire prophecy, the Lord did help Saul. A sudden attack upon the Philistine camp came at the same moment. An earthquake caused the ground to roll and quiver. In panic, the Philistines fled back to their fortified coastal cities. Saul's next campaign was against the Amalekites, enemies of Israel since the days of Exodus. Samuel, knowing that safety for the new nation lay in breaking the power of the Amalekites, gave the orders. Go, destroy Amalek, and spare nothing. Destroy men, women, and children, oxen, camels, and sheep. Leave nothing living in the land. When the battle was over and the Amalekites had been defeated, captured King Agag of Amalek was brought before Saul. And Saul said, Your life shall be spared. Your wealth of herds and flocks will be a rich addition to my kingdom. Returning in a triumphant procession, Saul came back to Gilgal again, where Samuel met him. As he watched Saul approach, the old high priest mused, This man I made a king. Will he ever learn to obey? He thinks he has been merciful, yet he really desired a trophy to exhibit to the people. When Samuel and Saul met face to face, the seated king looked up at Samuel and said defensively, High priest of God, I have obeyed your commands. Samuel said, So? Then tell me, what is that sound of oxen and sheep I hear outside that open window? Saul said, The people are responsible for that, not I. They insisted on saving the best of Amalek herds. They wanted them to offer as a great sacrifice on the altar of the Lord. My son, the Lord demands obedience, not burnt offerings. It is better to obey than to make sacrifices an excuse for stubborn disobedience." And Samuel looked upon Saul with a heavy heart, for he resolved that he would never see this man face to face again, yet he loved him. But in spite of his love, he must speak the final words of rejection. And Samuel said, "He who will not obey is not great enough to rule. Again I tell you, the kingship shall never pass to your sons. I go to seek a new king." But because of his love for this tragic figure, Samuel would not shame him before the people. Quietly he slipped away, leaving Saul to his sad and bitter thoughts. The remaining 8 years of Saul's reign passed quickly. During this time, Samuel died, and the character of the king deteriorated. A nervous instability, accentuated by a guilty conscience, made him a creature of jealousies and insane temper. Once, in a petulant rage, he hurled a spear at a young boy named David, upon whom he had previously looked with gentle favor. Not knowing who his successor would be, Saul looked in suspicious hatred upon any man who seemed to hold the affection of the people. The end came quickly. Once more the Philistines invaded Israel, and one evening the two armies faced each other on the plain of Esdraelon. At dawn the battle would begin. The mighty Saul, victor in every previous battle, was afraid. Feeling God-forsaken and lonely, he paced the tortured hours of darkness. There was no Samuel to turn to now. But in the village of Endor, nearby, there was a woman reputed to be able to foretell the future. Going to her, Saul demanded that she raise the spirit of the dead Samuel, so that the king might plead again for help. And when the spirit of Samuel seemed to appear, Saul cried in deep distress, "God has turned his face away from me." And Saul said, "I know not what to do." But there was no word of hope for this tragic man, pathetic in his fear and insecurity. In the morning the battle began, and continued through the long hours of the day. On every side the Israelites were driven back, and one by one the sons of Saul were slain. Finally, in the twilight hours, an arrow pierced the armor of Saul. Faint with weakness, Saul despairingly turned to his armor-bearer and pled, "Drive your sword through my body. I am not afraid to die, but if the Philistines should capture me alive, they would parade me through their cities, an object of mockery. If you pity your king, now kill me." But the armor-bearer refused, saying, "I cannot kill my king." Saul finally found the courage to do what had to be done. Placing the hilt of his royal sword against the ground, Saul fell forward upon the sharp point and died. The reign of Saul, king, had ended. Saul, man of tragedy, who in the morning of his life had a glorious appointment with destiny, but in the evening of his days kept a shameful rendezvous with lonely death. Here ends this tape. Please rewind it to the very beginning.